Today, we're going to talk about BIS 50% rule. And for that, we are welcoming back our sanctions expert, Hera Smith. Hera, how are you?
Doing great. Great to be back, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. And the irony of this is last time you were here, you bravely struggled through a sore throat and a cold and everything else. And
I remember.
Just for fairness, I've obviously decided to do the same. So unfortunately, I was at a conference last week. Somebody had something because everyone that was there now has the same bug. But we're going to struggle through. But if anyone's on audio only wondering why I sound like this, that is why.
Yeah. I'm being interviewed on an FM radio station.
Exactly. I was joking with Mark. I'll have to get a late night show after this, but we'll see how we go.
Yeah, replace Colbert or something.
Exactly. One can dream. Anyway, let's start where we always start, right? What is this? So what is BIS 50% rule?
BIS 50% rule is also called the affiliates rule. So basically, this is a rule that was issued by the United States government, specifically the Bureau of Industry and Security, so BIS or BIS. So BIS has a list of entities that they don't want to get, or they don't want U.S. technology getting into their hands. So they have export restrictions on them or export limitations on them. And they notice that a lot of these entities are using affiliates that they own to get those materials anyway. And so in order to close this loophole or this way of evading the rule, they decided to implement the 50% rule. This means that anything they own, 50% or more, are also considered to have the same export restrictions. And this applies to those on the BIS entity list, the military end user list, and certain specially designated nationals who are sanctioned.
Okay, so normally I then ask why, but I think you've kind of answered that. It's to close what sounds like a fairly obvious loophole. Is that fair?
Exactly, yes. There has been a lot of instances where they noticed that happened, and so they decided that we'll copy the OFAC 50% rule, which seems to work quite well. And it's something that the industry, the private sector, already has a framework in place to implement. And so they said to make it easier for everyone, we'll just adopt the same rule with pretty much the same regulations and nuances.
Okay, so ownership becomes paramount to understand in any third party you're dealing with then in this environment.
Exactly. It's really important to know if the person you're doing business with, your supplier, your customer, are owned 50% more by those listed entities, whether that's one level up or several levels up. It's also important to know whether they are aggregatedly owned by those people on the list. So say, for example, there's two BIS entity lists who own 30% each. That means that the entity they own is also considered to have the same export restrictions. But what's different about this rule from the OFAC 50% rule, OFAC is the sanctions agency. What's different about this is that they do aggregation or totaling the number of ownership across different lists. This is very different from the OFAC rule, which only does aggregation within the list.
Okay, so you're going, one might say that people should have been doing their ownership anyway as part of good due diligence, good KYC, or knowing your supplier, knowing your third party. But the additional step here is not just making sure you've got the calculation for that discovery. It's also this cross-list calculation that is that net new? Is that done anywhere else? Or is this the first time this has popped up on risk professionals' to-do list?
I would say aggregation has existed in the US and the EU from a sanctions perspective, but typically aggregation is within the list. So say, for example, you can't aggregate ownership for somebody on the OFAC SDN list and then somebody on the SSI list. So you can't add that up. However, in BIS, they decided that we're going to let you add that up. And the most restrictive export control in place will apply if they reach 50% or more.
Do we have any, it's quite hard right, when a new regulation or rule or anything comes out, there's normally a lag until there's an enforcement action that everyone then learns from. Yep. But do we have a expectation of what the enforcement trend might be on this? Do you think it's going to be super strict? Do you think it's going to be quick? Any sort of noises we're hearing from enforcement agencies, regulators, or sort of industry at large?
Well, let's see. Well, first of all, this rule was supposed to be effective September 29th, but it was suspended for a year. So enforcement isn't going to happen during that period. But at the same time, it's important for the private sector to make sure they are ready to comply with this when it does come into effect next year or sooner, depending on the circumstances. Additionally, in terms of penalties, it's really important to know that the BIS does take export control violations very, very seriously. The highest penalty to date is around $1.19 billion against a company that's billion with a B, which is huge. Additionally, violations of export control regulations come with imprisonment as well, which is different from OFAC penalties usually. It's not just fines for BIS violations. Let's see, in 2023, there were 67 convictions, and there was millions of dollars in fines or penalties. But at the same time, there was around 1,800 months of imprisonment that went with those convictions. So they're not playing.
No, and that's often something that is bemoaned in certain, journalistic circles or articles, right? That when something goes wrong in anti-money laundering, who's actually gone to prison? There's the risk, but it rarely happens. But it sounds like in this area, actually, it's happening quite a lot.
It is, yes. I've read so many cases regarding this one, and pretty much all of them come with imprisonment, like 20 years imprisonment. I think the standard BIS penalty is around $350,000 per violation, and around 20 years imprisonment.
Okay. And who does this affect? Is it particular industries? Is it everyone? Is it, particularly large firms, small firms? Is there sort of any trend around that we would look to as we try to guide people that are thinking, does this affect me? What should I be doing?
I think the industry that's most directly and immediately affected are corporations, especially corporations who deal with dual-use goods or those that deal with semiconductors or just more technical things that they manufacture. I could incorporate U.S. origin goods, so they would be the most affected. However, there are other industries that are indirectly affected as well. Say, for example, banks are also covered. There is the General Prohibition 10 that says that banks shouldn't facilitate transactions that are basically illegal. Insurance companies, also asset managers and others need to take this into account as well when they're doing their due diligence.
So I suppose everyone. Everyone in the value chain that gets, but with a special focus on that high-tech value chain. You mentioned semiconductors and that field.
Yes, that they are especially considered high risk here. But I would say generally all corporations need to take this into account when they're doing their due diligence. Yeah.
Okay. So what does that mean to the practitioner? Which practitioners, which departments are going to pick up the slack here for these corporations and other parties that are affected? Well, what does this mean for them in practical terms?
Let's see. Usually this would be picked up by the compliance department. Whoever is doing sanctions is probably going to be the same person picking this up. Usually it would probably fall under either the legal counsel side and or the compliance and ethics department. And in that case, they need to make sure that they do their due diligence. They look and see. It's really helpful to have a list of entities that are considered owned 50% or more by those on the mentioned lists, to just download it into your current screening system, add that in, and I think that is the easiest way to implement it.
Okay, so we'll come on to a little bit of that tools and technology and data in a second, but sounds like those teams, those compliance teams, are going to be the ones responsible, but in a RACI or ACI, if anyone's worked with that, there's going to be other people that are also going to be impacted, because the compliance team can set the policy, they can set the standard, they might even be able to advocate for a tool, but they're going to be relying on sales teams, procurement teams, supply chain teams as well, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. Procurement teams, supply chain teams especially, I think, would be affected, because if their vendor, their supplier is on that list, then they may need to start thinking about whether or not they need to find alternative suppliers, whether they need to insulate their supply chain from this compliance risk that's going to kick in a year. And really, a year is not a lot of time if you need to lock in your supplier months ahead or maybe years ahead as well.
Yeah, because I'm thinking through what the challenges will be, right? Because going and getting the data from a reputable source, that's one thing you can do and potentially bring it into your existing system. So it doesn't sound transformational, it almost sounds tactical. But if you're going to ask people to change their processes, change their supply chains or value chains, depending on exactly what you're trying to do, that is transformation. And I don't know about you, I've not seen any large company do transformation much quicker than 12 months.
Exactly. Yes. And so it's really important for them to start looking into this now. That way they're ready for the risk when it comes in a few months.
In your conversations, and you speak to, hundreds of customers, right, every year, maybe thousands even, when we think about the sort of conferencing and roundtables and things you do. Do you get the sense that everyone that needs to be is across this? Because in an organization, if you're a compliance person, you're probably reading about this. You've probably listened to this podcast because you want to validate your information or learn new information. But you're going to need some support, right, from CFO, CEO, COO to help you get this operationalized, budget anything you're going to need to buy in to help you with this. Do you think it's reaching those levels and getting the appropriate support from the conversations you're having?
I think that right now, some of them are. It's been escalated to the C-suite so that they can pull in the budget to be able to help address this new regulation. At the same time, there are those who went, once the BIS 50% rule was suspended for a year, they went, okay, well, this isn't as urgent this year. There are other things that are more urgent that I need to close before the end of the year. So we'll resume this talk in January. So it differs. I think for those that are in an industry that's higher risk or for larger corporations, they understand the risks that are associated with it and are taking immediate steps to address it.
You'd imagine this is a board level risk. It needs to be on those board reports saying this is new, this affects our supply chain, therefore it affects everything, product and sales and whatever that business does. Is it particularly for the US, or should all international companies care just as much? The comparison we made earlier was OFAC, where it doesn't matter where you are. If you do anything with US dollars, you care about OFAC. Is it the same in this, or is it different with BIS?
I would say it's similar in that it has a global effect, but not because of the reach of the US dollar, which is what OFAC sanctions relies on. In this case, it relies on US origin goods.
Okay.
And the reach of that. And it has a global effect because we're in a globalized world trying to deglobalize, in effect.
Yeah, so there'll be some international companies that say we don't do business in the US, so I need to be aware, but maybe I'm not too worried. But most major companies are going to be selling to the biggest economy in the world, therefore they're affected. Or am I, sorry, maybe I've got the wrong end of the stick. I can sort of see you going, well, not quite.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that even for like companies in the UK or Europe, they need to take this into account, especially if they're incorporating US origin goods into whatever they're manufacturing or selling.
Okay.
Yeah, they need to do their checks. So it's also about who they sell to, but also upstream.
Who they buy from. Okay, so either side, so you need to have absolute confidence that nothing in your supply chain touches the United States.
Which is very hard.
Yeah.
For example, if you're an airline, and you have you want to sell old planes because you're not going to use them anymore, then you need to do a lot of checks. Or if you're just a generic company and you have people who are crossing borders together with some equipment that might have U.S. origin goods, then maybe you need an export license.
Okay. And if we take that example of a plane, right? I don't know how many parts go into a plane and how many suppliers, but I assume a lot.
Yes.
Lots of specialisms, lots of hyper specialization.
Lots of dual-use goods.
Exactly. And each of those will have their suppliers. With this BIS rule, are they talking about that end-tier supply chain? So not just your suppliers, but the suppliers below, that supply them and so on and so forth. Is that also in scope?
I would say so. It's interesting because in a way that's helpful if you're trying to figure out if the rule applies to you. But that's a lot of work to figure out if it applies to you. Maybe it's easier in some ways to just do an initial risk assessment of what your exposure to those entities even look like before you do deep dives into whether or not it applies.
Yeah. Okay. I'm a slight wry smile on my face because I feel like almost every topic we cover on this podcast, regardless of the risk type, kind of comes back to, do you truly understand the third party? Maybe I'm biased because obviously this KYC Decoded podcast that we've sort of started with, and from that background, I always think that KYC or know your third party is of prime importance, but every other risk relies on it, it seems like. So if you
that's right.
If you don't understand all the parts in your your goods that you're assembling or everyone you're selling to, and you don't understand the people behind them and the ownership links, you mentioned the aggregation, then you don't have a starting point. And then potentially, we'll see if this plays out, but with things like modern slavery, forced labor regulation, which I'm talking about later today, funnily enough, the end tier is critically important. And so I could imagine a world where once people have got an initial system, the next question will be, and what about the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 suppliers potentially, which is a lot of work. But also if you want to make a regulation really work, you've got to go to that level, because if today people are going, well, we'll just use affiliates, then the next thing they would do to try and get around it is go, well, we'll just set up another company that supplies that company and then we'll skirt it that way. So unless you keep checking, then
also downstream as well, you have to make sure that who you're sending your goods to is the end user, and if it's not, then who else are they sending it to? Who are they transshipping it to or reshipping it to, in effect? And that is really tricky to figure out. In some cases, you have distributors who are not entirely transparent, and you're going to have to do due diligence on that and figure out what controls you can put in place to mitigate that risk.
The temporary suspension that you mentioned, so there's a year sort of grace period, for lack of a better term. Do we think that it is just going to be a year and then it's definitely on, or is there any potential that actually this suspension, other things happen and then it goes away? Like, I'm sort of curious as to how companies are thinking they should react to this 12-month period.
That's a really good question. I think it's hard to tell what the political winds or the political direction will go within the next 12 months. There's a lot of changes going on. So with that said, I think it's best to be ready. I think that the year is a solid period, but it could be implemented earlier. So my opinion is that I think they'll stick to a year just because it takes so much time to implement controls. And a lot of corporations have complained about how onerous this is.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. You actually mentioned it a bit earlier, right? What do you do? Tech, data definitely both have a role to play. There's also politics within corporations of trying to get things through and get teams set up and change management. If you were in one of your old roles, before Moody's, where you were implementing sanctions programs, or if you just think about list screening and the checks, what would you be doing to get ready?
Well, for one, I would go and get a list of entities that are owned 50% or more by those listed entities and start screening against them now, just to get an initial picture of what my risk looks like. And once I have the matches confirmed, the risk sorted out, then I'll go a step further and actually look at those who are minority owned by those on the list. That minority ownership and influence is also something that's considered a red flag in accordance with the BIS 50% rule or affiliates rule. This is something that they've highlighted in there, so it's important to look at minority ownership. It is possible to get a list of that as well if you want to screen against it, and then do further due diligence on that to figure out if you are being used to evade or get around the export restrictions.
And when we think about, so you've buy these lists in, allowed you to do some screening, what does good look like? How do you get confidence that the list you get, whether that's from Moody's or one of our data competitors, how do you get confidence that that list has everything you need and is what you're going to need to make sure you stay compliant?
I would say I'd consider getting from a vendor that has very exhaustive ownership information. And at the same time, being a compliance professional, I would say I'm a little skeptical. So I want to actually see what the data behind it is. So being able to see the whole ownership structure separately for cases that require more due diligence or a higher risk is something that I would be interested in. So if I can see based on this whole ownership chain who exactly the players are and who the other players are that's on the list, whether that's majority or minority owned, this is something that would be very, very valuable for me if I was doing a deep dive into a specific case.
Okay. And so you're going to test that data, make sure it has the quality. The other thing we often talk about in screening is efficiency. And there's the fear that you mentioned earlier. If something becomes too much work, then corporations don't necessarily know what to do. In this case, how does someone stay on top of the efficiency? What impact do we think this is going to have workload-wise? Because hopefully you screen, there's no matches, you're good. But we all know it doesn't typically work that way. There's going to be some matches that are true, and there's going to be a lot of matches that you need to check and make sure, and some of them will be false positives. How does someone stay on top of that?
Well, I think this is where proactive or early screening comes in. If you are able to front load that work before the rule comes into effect, then you've tackled the initial workload of all the matches that come in when you first ingest something new into your screening system. And then once the rules kicks in, or after you do the initial work, you only have to look at the delta. You only have to look at the delta or the change that happens, whether that's because there's new entities on the list, ownership changes, or changes in your customer data.
Okay. So, I mean, just like BIS has essentially learned from OFAC and implemented a similar system, similarly for practitioners, well, there are already some pretty good systems and ways of working in screening that can be applied here to get this done as efficiently and effectively as possible.
Exactly, yes.
Fantastic. And again, Hera, so you've got an interesting career, right? Because the first part where you've built up all your experience, knowledge, etc., you've implemented sanctions programs at numerous organizations. And now you're on the vendor side. So you used to bring in the tools, implement them, test them, find them what the right combination, and now you actually help develop them.
Yep. It's been fun.
So I guess my question is, like, if you could have two of you and one on either side, what do you wish the other knew? So like when you're a practitioner, what do you wish a vendor would know and apply to this situation? And similarly, if second part of the question, as a vendor, what do you wish the practitioners trying to implement this would understand about the vendor side?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say the compliance professional in me wishes that the vendor could solve all of our problems from a technological standpoint, because BIS 50 is just one of the many, many, many risks that we have to deal with. And if they could help us tackle more complex problems, that would be fantastic. And there's so many in there. And I wish that I could, spend more time with a vendor / product to help address all of these. But at the same time, being in a vendor position, I know that from a more realistic perspective, there's only so much we can do at a specific point in time. Additionally, specific vendors have specific strengths, so to speak. So we can't do everything for everybody, which is interesting. However, if you are able to find a good partner who's a vendor, a technology company, a data company who's willing to work with you to create solutions, I think that is very, very helpful because the solutions you're facing, you might consider a little bespoke to your company, but in reality, in most cases, it's something that cuts across all the different peers or industries that work in that space as well.
Okay. And from the vendor side, what do you wish the practitioner understood when they're implementing this? Like what would make a great partner for the vendor, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I would say I'd appreciate the vendor side of me would appreciate a customer who is enthusiastic about exploring solutions, who's not afraid to check and look at the new solutions out there. It's not just about risk. There's also a lot of benefits associated with that. So I think that's helpful. Additionally, I I think it's also helpful to have a customer who has a realistic view or realistic expectations with regard to what solutions or companies can deliver for them. We can't give you the moon, but maybe we can give you a picture of the moon.
Well, I think that's realistic, right? Like data and technology can take you a lot of the way because a lot of smart people are thinking about that at various vendors. And, I think we're particularly good at ownership, which sets us up well for this one at Moody's. But then you still have to have expertise in-house or brought in to come and implement well, get that change management right, and to accept that there's going to be some level of workload that needs to be managed. Great things you can do with normal filtering, we'll say that first. Great things you can do with supervised learning. There's great things you can do with AI, but there's not a silver bullet. It's a combination of things and continuous improvement that tends to win the day, rather than one thing to solve all problems.
Exactly. I think the AI arc is a good example of that. There's a lot of fear initially about AI and skepticism, properly so. However, there's also an advantage to being a first mover in this sphere and trying to figure out what can you automate in your workflow, what's a repetitive manual task that you can automate to make your employees' lives easier and better so that they can focus on other risk areas that are not being looked at because they're too busy doing manual repetitive tasks.
Absolutely. And the last thing I'll say, and then I think we'll probably wrap up with some recommended resources, is I was at I was moderating a panel last week, right, with our friends at SAP, and they were talking about, the desire for trusted data, credible data to power workflows. And we also had Helen Ryder representing Moody's, our global head of sales, talking about the fact that when you've got the best data, what you really want to do is get it where customers are already doing their work because you reduce that amount of change management. And so with SAP and others, there are opportunities there where perhaps BIS 50, as you say, is one thing among many. So how do we get the right data, analytic, any additional tech into the systems that people are already doing this work? So it's not another siloed process, but it is part of an existing workflow. And I think if we can get that, and the people that are implementing this on the practitioner side, that might go a long way to making this as not painless, because there's always work and there's always risk, and that's why these jobs exist, but makes it as manageable, I think, as possible.
Yeah, definitely. That's something that the customers I've spoken to would like. They want it integrated into their current workflows, their current systems, so that they don't have to use another platform, another website, or another something that they need to log into in order to do this extra bit of work. If it can be integrated into what they currently do or look at, then that saves them a lot of work.
Fantastic. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, one thing I'd like to talk about that we haven't quite touched on is the data. The BIS 50 list that we've generated has some really interesting stories behind it, I think, and tying that into the geopolitics that's associated with this topic, which is that the BIS 50% rule was suspended because of the trade negotiations between the U.S. and China. However, if you look at the data, because the country with the most number of entities that are on this 50% list is really Russia. And there's around 12,000 Russian companies in there. Of course, you can argue that maybe Russia doesn't really get U.S. technology or is not supposed to anyway. But it's interesting that the main beneficiary is Russia. Second is China, and then there's Iran as well. Interestingly, there's also additional collateral damage in that there's more than 1,000 Western European companies that are caught in the net. They are also entities that you need to do extra due diligence on because they have export restrictions on them.
Okay, so yeah, because it's so obviously we've talked 3 or 4 podcasts of you and me talking about impact on the war in Ukraine and sanctions on Russia, but it sounds like this BIS thing, you're gonna have to figure out, have you caught it anyway because of those other programs, or is there some grey area here where you're going to need to maybe seek clarity from your legal department, your regulators as well? I suppose the first step is still the same though. You've got a screen now, and then figure out what your exposure is, then go have those conversations, because until then it's all theoretical.
Yes, exactly. Really good summary.
There we go. And if somebody wanted to think like you do, Hera, and sort of try to play this out in the theory as they think about what to do, where would you send them? Like, what should they be reading? What should they be watching or listening to? What should we put in the show notes, basically?
I see. I was going to say, what should they listen to this podcast? But, let's see. There's a lot of, there's the BIS 50% rule. It's always helpful to go to the primary source. And there's also the suspension announcement. It's helpful to read the rules and the FAQs that go with it. But in addition to that, there's been a lot of law firm articles out there that talk about this rule and the implications of it and what you need to look out for. So I think that is something that is very helpful. I can share the links to some of the few that I've read that I found very helpful with you so that we can share it with the audience.
That'd be great. I think, as you say, ground truth, particularly if you're a compliance professional, that's your job, right, to go and understand that. But for those that might be listening in a non-compliance role but might have impact on this, supply chain professionals, etc., maybe those law firm articles can sort of bring it into less compliance jargon and bring it into more plain English language for those of us that want to get on and do the thing.
And then you can use AI to summarize it.
Well, there you go. And then double check anyway.
Exactly.
Well, Hera, thank you so much for coming in again and sort of bringing this to life for us. Hope the audience found it helpful. And with that, I'll say thank you. Thanks to our marketing team and thanks to Mark for putting this together.
Yeah, thank you. Hope you feel better soon.
Thanks.